I don't need to tell any of you just how celebrated Luc Sante is in this town. You only need to observe all the pandemonium outside with the photographers and the red carpets, and this kind of thing follows him around wherever he goes. Why is he so loved? Because he writes about things people want to read about in a way that makes them want to read what he writes. He writes about a lot of things, but over the years, he's come to write quite a bit about photography. And this is odd because he kind of stumbled into it. He published a book called Low Life in 1991 that was very successful. And in the research for that book, he came upon a cache of photographs from 1914 to 1918 in the New York City police archives that were taken to provide evidence in murder cases and suicides. And Luc wrote into those photographs to produce a book called Evidence in 1992. 1992? Yeah. And from that point on, he was treated as an expert in photography, something he's never claimed to be. He's always been a writer who is fascinated by photographs and what they do and what we do with them. It's very difficult to write well about photography. One of the paradoxes in it is that often the most seemingly obvious things about photography can yield the most penetrating analysis. But for that to happen, one has to have an almost childlike curiosity about appearances and a belief in the mysterious link between the visual and the verbal in ekphrasis. Consequently, a lot of people have written about photography, but only a few have consistently written well about it, and Luc Sante is one of them. Tonight, I think he's going to talk about how photography is unlike other arts and how this distinction works in practice. Luc Sante is the author of Low Life, Evidence, The Factory of Facts, Kill All Your Darlings, and Folk Photography, among many other titles. He's a neighbor of mine up the river in Ulster County, and he teaches, actually not anymore, I guess, or not now.
Well, I'm going to leave for a year. I'm still there.
Temporarily, a New Yorker again. And he teaches writing and the history of photography at Bard College. In a wonderful essay called French Without Tears that appeared in an anthology called The Genius of Language, Luc described himself as a French modernist. And there's some truth to that. But he's a French modernist who's picked up on the American idiom in a remarkable way. Peter Sheldall, who was on this stage 2 years ago, has called him, quote, one of the handful of living masters of the American language, as well as a singular historian and philosopher of American experience. I couldn't say it better myself. Please welcome Luc Sante.
Wow, thank you, Levi, and thank you all for coming. Nice to see so many faces out there. Yeah, it's weird. I'm being a New Yorker this year for the first time. Well, I'm being a Manhattanite for the first time in 20 years, which is really bizarre. This is not New York. This is Kuala Lumpur, Tokyo, Berlin. I don't know. It's some other city from the one I knew. But it's energizing. So, I'm going to tell you about how photography is not like other arts, and also about why I'm fascinated about photography, I guess. And I called it the genius of the system, which I'll explain later. Last year, I drove with my partner to the artist colony in Wyoming, where she was to spend the following month working on her novel. I drove back across the country slowly by myself. As I've done on such drives for many years, I stopped at every junk shop and antiques barn along the way looking for photographs. Time was when they'd be crammed into drawers, piled in baskets, heaped in salad bowls, but they're harder to find nowadays, skimmed off by pickers and slapped up on eBay. At first I found mostly generic snapshots and studio portraits, but I'm always thorough and always check behind and under things, so I kept looking. In the town of Gering, next door to Scotts Bluff in the Nebraska Panhandle, I stopped at a used furniture store. Everything in the place was big. jukeboxes, dining room tables, vintage refrigerators. But then I started looking through the glass doors of a series of hutches parked along the wall. Inside one of them, I spotted a small cardboard box labeled postcards. There were only about 20 of them, but 5 of them were actual photos, and among them was this one. Dating from around 1910, and taken just a few miles from where I found it, the picture is both simple and not. On the one hand, it shows what are probably after effects of a tornado, scattered wreckage, and a sign noting the location of the county abstractor, an official who maintains records of land titles. On the other hand, it appears to be an example of formal abstraction, made at a time and in a place where you would hardly expect such a thing. So it's probably an accident, right? Made by an amateur, aiming for a result different from the outcome. But if that was the case, why is the picture neatly divided into thirds? Why is the right edge of the sign aligned with that of the brick wall? Why is the top of the sign positioned to form a kind of wave with the 2 shed roofs? Why does the sign take up almost exactly the same space as the dark shed next to it, which in turn is echoed by the shed on the right? And what might the photographer have been aiming for otherwise in this bleak scene? What could be abstracter? The picture is unsigned, so it's likely I'll never find out anything more about it, unless, as has actually happened to me once or twice, I stumble upon another copy of the same picture, this one bearing a caption, maybe a signature. But even those things couldn't tell me what I want to know. If I were to come upon a substantial body of pictures by the same photographer, I might be able to make some guesses concerning his or her interests, ambitions, work habits, sense of humor, visual education, and imaginative empathy. But even a great deal of insight into the artist's thought processes and relative sophistication might still not answer the very large question of how a work of photographic abstraction could have been made at the far western edge of Nebraska around the time when Picasso and Braque were just beginning their investigations into analytical cubism. Photography is endlessly mysterious to me, and the more I immerse myself in it, the more mysterious it seems. It has become a major part of my life in ways I could not have predicted when I was younger. For the past 13 years, I've been teaching the history of photography fall semesters at Bard College. In the spring, I teach writing. And I've written 3 books on the subject, as well as dozens of essays, book introductions, and catalog text. But I came to it in a circuitous and almost accidental way. As a teenager, I admired Walker Evans and Robert Frank, the former because one of my teachers gave me a copy of Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. He thought James Agee would be a good model for my writing, and he wasn't entirely wrong. The latter is a direct consequence of his cover images for the Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street. I liked their work enough that I forswore taking pictures myself back when I was still considering visual art as a vocation, because I thought I'd never be capable of more than pale imitation. But I didn't really start thinking seriously about photography until I was in my late 20s and living on the Lower East Side. It was the early 80s, a time of enormous change, one of the transitional signs of that change being that Astor Place was, for a while, a vast flea market running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The old residents needed money badly, and the new residents were eager to spend. So every sort of object was pulled from closets and corners and basements and trash cans and the recently vacated apartments of the dead and put out on the sidewalks. One day I was walking home from work, checking out the wares, when I spotted this picture, topping a small pile at the feet of a large man staring impassively into the far distance. What the devil was this, I thought. It was clearly an original photograph, clearly old, but what it depicted was so far from the norm from the old photographs I saw under such circumstances that I couldn't quite persuade myself that it could be real. And yet its authenticity was confirmed by the other pictures in the stack, more than 30 of them. The others showing American troops aboard a ship, aboard a train, parading and posing and fighting in what was clearly a Mexican city. All the pictures measured 3.5 inches by 5.25. All were on postcard stock. None had been mailed, but some had penciled notes on their backs, and they seemed to be the work of a number of different photographers. I bought the guy's entire inventory for $10. Eventually, I learned that the photos depicted aspects of the so-called punitive expedition to Veracruz, Mexico, in 1916-17 by U.S. troops under the command of General John J. Pershing. This picture, the only one to bear a photographer's signature, is the work of Walter P. Hadsell, an American who'd established himself in Veracruz before the war, working there as a photographer for nearly 20 years. A couple of weeks later, I happened into an antique shop in Greenwich Avenue that had a revolving rack where, amid Easter greetings and colored lithos of the Washington Monument, I found 2 more Mexican Revolution photo cards, 50 cents apiece. Soon after, on a trip upstate, I hit a few antique shops where I found more photo cards, not of Mexico or war, but of American small towns, train wrecks and fires and picnics and parades. I bought a stack of them. I didn't have much money, but most only cost a quarter. Some were a dime. Very soon I was seizing every opportunity to visit antique shops and rifle them for photo cards, which were sometimes filed in drawers or shoeboxes and sometimes jumbled on tabletops. A vast new world, apparently uncharted, was opening up before my eyes. I was not unacquainted with the photographic postcard per se. I spent my early childhood in Belgium, where the use of photo cards hung on into the middle of the 20th century, long enough that 2 or 3 of my own baby pictures were made into cards, which may have been mailed to relatives or simply represented an option based on size. But I'd never imagined the vast range of the American photo postcard. I fell entirely under its spell and collected the cards for almost 30 years. I knew very early on that I'd eventually write a book about them, and made a pact with myself that I'd stop collecting once I'd written the book. That wasn't a very good way to spur myself to write, but on the other hand, it did allow me proper time to begin to educate myself on the subject. There's not much of a curriculum, a few decent books, but their focus is necessarily narrow because the subject is so awesomely vast. The only way I could study the phenomenon of the real photo postcard as a totality was to spend 30 years looking at untold numbers of them, in the hundreds of thousands at the very least. The phenomenon is temporally delimited, starting in 1905 and peaking around 1910, then dipping seriously in 1914 and sputtering out gradually through the 1920s and 30s. But there's no way of knowing or even estimating how many cards were made during that time, probably in the millions some years, nor what percentage of them survived the century. A card could have had an edition of 1, after all, or of several hundred. It's always exciting to see a card a second time, although a third sighting threatens to make it common. Some cards can be identified by date, place, and photographer, while many others are completely mute. Many cards were never mailed, but saved as souvenirs. What distinguishes them from other sorts of postcards is not only that they were made in the darkroom as contact prints from the negative plates, but also that they were made in places that were far outside any tourist orbit. They were not meant for visitors, but strictly for local citizens to send back to their families who were understood to be elsewhere. The American nation was still on the move then, in a sort of backdraft of the original westward drive. People were beginning to populate the sorts of places the pioneers overlooked or scorned on their way toward the Pacific. Business and government were united in trying to create a breadbasket out of dry, unstable prairie. Towns would spring up like mushrooms, and very soon they'd have a brass band and a baseball team and 2 churches and a pool room and a drunk tank. People would drift in from somewhere that was getting too crowded, and they might stay for 2 weeks or for the rest of their lives. The small town and the countryside were mostly humdrum, with hard, unrelenting work repeated daily, punctuated only by small joys and the occasional gut-wrenching disaster. The photographers caught all of it. The rise and spread of the photographic postcard in America followed a template that might sound familiar nowadays. A widespread, if inarticulate need was answered by rapidly developing technology under the cover of a popular fad. Furthermore, this new technology fostered a new kind of expression, a new form of expression, which reflected the moment and allowed it to be consumed almost in the same moment. And it was ridiculously democratic. Pictures were taken by all sorts of people for all sorts of reasons. All the extremes of photography are present, united by the standardization of the format. Pictures were made by amateurs and professionals, artists and hacks, for profit and for love and for completely unguessable reasons. Some of their makers left behind archives and records of their careers. Others didn't leave so much as a name. It was a purely grassroots enterprise. Some photographers may have been extremely prolific, may have started branch studios in other towns, may have made sure their name appeared in large letters front and back. But even so, their impact was almost entirely local. Besides a few trade magazines that mostly dispensed technical tips, and maybe more importantly, ran classified ads for jobs and studios and equipment, there was no connective tissue among photographers. They weren't trying to imitate anyone, except possibly some memory from among the relatively few photographs they would have seen. Sometimes, looking at these cards, you come upon a picture that makes you feel as if its maker had just discovered photography, had made it up by himself from scratch. The American Real Photo postcard is a laboratory for the social uses of photography. If you could somehow assemble all the cards that were taken between 1905 and 1920, you would have a true mirror reflection, almost a one-to-one scale map of the non-urban United States then, in all its splendor and misery. That's not something you can say about any other photographic format, not the tintype or the snapshot or the ambrotype or the Kodachrome slide or the stereoscope card. That is partly because those other formats tended, because of their specific properties, to be applied to very specific uses and occasions, but partly also because of the genuine sense of discovery and curiosity that was both fostered and rewarded by the postcard medium. A popular documentary impulse was born of people's wish to share news of their lives with their widely dispersed relatives. They want to show them the new depot, the circus parade, the flood downtown, perhaps even the bank heist and the lynching. And because most photographers had at best notched an apprenticeship with a small-town portraitist, they hadn't been inculcated with any principles of composition and lighting that would inevitably be tied to current fashions. So they had no choice but to make their own decisions. The best among them were able to look at things absolutely afresh. But you can't always tell how intentional any decision might have been. Like all vernacular photographs that are viewed, as it were, in a vacuum, without guarantees of context, of famous signature or museum sponsorship, real photo postcards require a sort of binocular vision. They must be viewed, that is, on 2 planes at once, the aesthetic and the socio-historical. Few postcards satisfy both demands equally. The weight of the socio-historical information in any given image is such that it can sometimes be mistaken for aesthetic content. Sometimes the aesthetic measure consists of a kind of absence, an apparent refusal or inability to do anything more than state facts, which we in turn perceive as beautiful because they are so distant or so bare. Cases in which a postcard image was unequivocally intended by its maker to convey an aesthetic effect. An interior shot, for example, that is cunningly lit and is expressively angled, usually seem awkward and overreaching. And yet an image rich in socio-historical information can be dull, can be badly lit or framed, can bury the lead in any number of uninteresting ways. Simplicity and frontality are key to the aesthetic of the cards, of early 20th century American vernacular photography in general, but they're no guarantee of aesthetic worth. But at their best, the cards represent something unfakeable, an authority of expression that seems to spring from the soil, the pure representation of a time and place, so that their essence seems to be of a piece with their subjects. While I was immersing myself in the ocean of the real photo postcard, I was doing many other things not involving photography. In 1990, I'd finished writing my first book, Low Life, Lures and Snares of Old New York, and now I had the task of finding illustrations for it. I'd never done any such thing before. I remember photographs from the early 20th century that were credited to an agency called Brown Brothers, and I tracked down their archive, which was then operated out of a garage somewhere in Pennsylvania by a mother and son who perhaps inherited it. When I mailed them a list of the subjects I was interested in, they sent me by return mail a box stuffed with period prints. Pictures a century old, some of them decorated with ancient editorial crop marks. But although many of their pictures were excellent, they didn't supply everything I needed. I'd written a book which I hoped conveyed the daily lives of slum dwellers in New York City before World War I, and yet I hadn't been able to find any photographic representations of that life beyond the familiar pictures by Jacob Riis and Louis Hine. I looked through the archives of the New York Historical Society and the Museum of the City of New York, and they lent me many wonderful pictures, but which nevertheless lacked that quality of intimacy, of interior life. I visited the municipal archives and began speculatively unspooling quantities of microfilm, the collections of all sorts of city agencies, but I was getting nowhere until the director, Kenneth Cobb, asked me if I'd seen the police files. When I began leafing through the 14 ring binders containing prints made from the collection's glass negatives, I was overcome by a sensation that mingled great joy and a kind of dread. The pictures answered all my requirements and then some. The murdered citizens of New York in the years 1914 to 1918 were shown in mercilessly detailed and graphic photos, many of them taken in their tenement rooms as they lay surrounded like the pharaohs in their tombs by all the impedimenta of their lives. Every knick-knack and chromo and dirty dish and discarded newspaper accounted for. The lenses employed were extremely wide angle, so that in shots taken from overhead, the legs of the tripod intruded like giant insect exoskeletons. And yet the lighting was somehow warm as well as pervasive, perhaps because the magnesium powder flash was already beginning to decay at the edges of the picture field by the end of the relatively long exposure, so that the bodies were encircled by a kind of penumbra. The pictures were sometimes horrifying, and yet they exuded a palpable sympathy for their helpless subjects, who could appear suffused with a kind of exaltation. And while it was true that the quality of the pictures varied, I still could perceive what I took to be a style. I imagined I'd stumbled upon a neglected master, some previously unknown photographer from the beginning of the 20th century who shared the sensitivity of Eugène Atget, while anticipating the unflinching stare of Ouija. After choosing a handful of pictures to illustrate my book, I persuaded my publisher to draw up a contract for a new book about the photos in the archive. I couldn't shake them. They needed to be seen. I had to investigate the conditions of their making. When I began looking at the pictures in extended fashion, they presented me with a concatenation of puzzles and problems. It turned out that the 1,400 glass plates had been salvaged by city archivists from a couple of filing cabinets in a small room under a staircase that had been overlooked by the contractors hired to clear out the basement of the old police headquarters on Mulberry Street after it was sold to developers in the 1980s. The plates had been housed in individual manila envelopes, but they hadn't been properly maintained. Many were cracked and their emulsion was peeling, and quite a few displayed moisture rings. Furthermore, the envelopes had deteriorated in many cases, so that the captions written on them, already skeletal at best, were completely illegible. I gleaned a handful of addresses and dates, a few names, and not much else. I briefly imagined there would be a corresponding dossier giving details of the cases. There was no such thing, or at least the police department had not released such a thing to public view. I didn't know who'd taken the pictures. Sometimes I didn't know why they'd been taken. For example, a view of a large room with men lined up against the walls, but the focus on the floorboards, which displayed no obvious points of interest. I didn't know why a subject would be photographed several times from contrasting angles, with important details differing significantly from one shot to the next, clothing disarranged, or furniture moved around, or the body itself moved from one place to another. How could such obviously manipulated scenes assist in a criminal investigation? I had no idea of the criteria applied to crime scenes. Wait. Oh, I see. I had no idea of the criteria applied to crime scenes. Were only some cases photographed, or were all the other homicides from those years among the glass plates that had presumably been removed to a landfill sometime in the previous decade? Eventually, I answered some of those questions. I identified some of the 7 names that were attached, sometimes repeatedly. 4 of them were policemen from the Fingerprint and Identification Bureau, which meant that they were very likely the photographers, and at least one of the other names was that of a known commercial photographer, presumably hired on a per-case basis. I was able to track down some of the cases by matching their names or dates or other salient details to accounts I found in newspapers, in particular the New York American, the closest thing the city had to a tabloid in that pre-tabloid era. I speculated that the inexplicable alterations to the scenes, contrary to the explicit instructions given by Alphonse Bertillon, the French police official who devised the standard worldwide protocol for crime scene photography, could be explained by poor departmental discipline, hierarchy disputes, a lack of understanding of the importance of photography on the part of the rank and file, or some combination of those elements. But I couldn't explain away the fundamental mystery of these photographs. Somehow a style was on display, one that had been created by some combination of equipment and standard practice, so that it could erase the differences among those 7 photographers and look and behave very much in an individual manner. I looked at forensic photographs from other places and other times, including pictures made by the police in Paris just a few years earlier. There was no mistaking one for another. These pictures were as distinct as if they'd been the result of conscious stylistic decisions. And there remained, too, that nagging matter of feeling. I'd begun to think that I could divine something of a photographer's human qualities from looking at a picture or a set of pictures. Something about the way human beings were depicted, something projected by the photographer and bounced back to the lens by the subject. But could I maintain such a belief in the face of the obvious fact that these were mere bureaucratic records collected by functionaries? And yet, nevertheless, something closely resembling emotion can be detected in a number of the pictures, all rational thought to the contrary. The photographs have an uncanny ability to make viewers consider such propositions as grace and soul and beatitude, and not only as a simple result of the narratives they cap. A couple of years ago, I was idly scrolling through the listings for pre-1950 photographs on eBay when a thumbnail on the left-hand margin caught my eye. Something about the lighting or the framing caused me to immediately identify it as a crime scene shot by the NYPD. It was one of a lot of 7 assorted photos, some interesting and some not, some competent and some not, that had been taken sometime after the subjects of my book, but earlier than 1950, apparently in New York City, but probably not in Manhattan to judge by the building stock. The information given by the seller was scant and non-existent. They were identified as crime scenes, it is true, but I hardly needed to be told. They were original prints, which was interesting since the pictures in my book had been preserved only as glass plate negatives. The wide range in print quality indicated a variety of hands had been involved. Eventually, I bought about 100 photos from the same source, an old woman who allowed that her father had been a police detective in Brooklyn. I didn't succeed in getting much information from her. She was alternately vague, kittenish, and obdurate. She didn't know, and she didn't want to know. I nevertheless pestered her with questions for months. I wanted to know, for one thing, why there were no bodies in the pictures. It turned out she did possess a number of photographs of murder victims, but she was holding out for more money, and she implied she had a line on some well-heeled collectors, perhaps hoping to spark my competitive zeal. Eventually, I got her to send me some scans. The result came as a relief in a way, since I wasn't tempted to spend beyond my very limited means, but overall they came as a disappointment. The pictures were brutal, without mystery. They simply looked like illustrations in the detective magazines of the period. Whatever circumstances of equipment and procedure connected these pictures to the ones in my book did not hold for the photographs involving corpses. The ones pictured in 1914 had sometimes appeared to project feeling, even in death. These did not. They were merely dead. The difference may simply have been a matter of lighting, of the burst and decay of the magnesium powder, as opposed to the sustained and pitiless interrogation of the flash bulb. But I was struck by the scale of the unpopulated pictures, their depth, their focus on an unoccupied middle distance. It was as if each of them were a stage set for a play that had been and gone, or maybe had not yet occurred. In each of the pictures, what is most notable is a central lack, an absence, a void. In other words, of course, they are scenes of crimes. As a photographic subject, the scene of a crime is unusual in that its presence can be embodied in its absence. To hijack Randall Jarrell's definition of the novel, a crime scene photograph is an unremarkable depiction of an unremarkable view that has something wrong with it. Very often, the only hint we have that a photograph depicts a crime scene is that the subject is of such a staggering banality. That it would be difficult to think of any other reason for its photographic depiction. Sometimes the image teases the eye, suggesting clues that may well dissolve upon closer examination. Sometimes the focus is deliberate and concentrated, but it is not always clear when it is simply the result of ineptitude. Sometimes crime scene pictures can resemble nature photography, but without the presence of nature. Very often the scene is as near to a blank canvas as is possible without fading entirely into nothingness. When Walter Benjamin compared Adjé's photographs to the crime scenes, he was primarily referring to the similar quality of absence in the pictures that Adjé took of city streets at dawn. But there is a difference. Adjé's subjects are of interest in themselves. His pictures are unpopulated so that the viewer will not be distracted from the aspect to which he wants to draw the viewer's attention. In these pictures, on the other hand, there is no such inherent interest. The point of focus can only be on what is missing. It is a bit like Sherlock Holmes's dog that failed to bark. Each of these photographs is a signpost featuring a giant illuminated arrow pointing to an empty field. If you come upon such a picture bereft of any context, you will find yourself helplessly looking for a clue, a hidden statement, a punchline. And the pictures gave me even less information than had the ones in the municipal archives. There are exactly 2 dates in the entire lot, 1931 and 1937. And in addition, a legible license plate on a car is a World's Fair Special, 1940. There's 1 noted address and 4 specified precincts, all in Brooklyn, and that's all. There are no names, nothing I could look up in the press. Much more than the earlier photographs, these forced me to consider them strictly as pictures, entirely untethered to anecdote. To begin with, what did it mean that I had immediately, in a minuscule reproduction, connected these pictures to the ones in my earlier study? Was what I had taken for a style been merely the result of an array of circumstantial factors involving happenstance, laziness, hierarchy, bureaucracy, inconsistency, and spatial and technical limitations? And if so, were those factors unchanged in the NYPD more than 20 years later? It's true that as far as crime scene photos went, every city, New York, Paris, Los Angeles, Mexico City, Sydney, seemed to have its own distinct, what? Style wasn't the word. For one thing, even beyond the apparent moral hazard implied by such a term, it was unconscious. Could we call it a fingerprint, a profile, an MO? The available language appears loaded, but for good reason. The connection is not idle. Detectives are in the business of detecting patterns of display or behavior that the parties themselves are oblivious to. Criminal investigation is in effect an intense critique of style, which subjects people, places, and things to a relentless examination. Every homicide detective as rigorous as the most exacting scholar or curator or impresario or fashion buyer or grant panel judge, lavishing such attention most often upon people, places, and things that would not otherwise be the object of such scrutiny. As a consequence, criminal investigation is uniquely suited to supply a broad range of answers when we want to know how people lived, since most crime scenes are rigorously ordinary, since crime can occur anywhere, all the way from the front parlor to the crawl space under the stairs, since people do not have the opportunity to clean up for company, since crime and economic standing are so often intertwined, since until recently most crime victims were not of a class able to afford to record their lives photographically. So it is that the archived remnants of criminal investigations of the past are superior if usually neglected anthropological documents, containing incidental information that often cannot be found anywhere else. But because these are also pictures, photographs, members of a category of object that also includes deliberate confections and fashion statements and works of art, we can confer aesthetic values upon them that were never intended by anyone connected with their making, but are no less real for all of that. Style is not an endpoint, but a process, one that the photographer sets in motion, but that is provisionally completed by whoever looks at the work so that its meaning remains in flux. Blank picture, how weird. There actually was a picture, but I don't know what happened in the end. Photography is unlike other arts in at least one respect. It is seldom entirely within the control of the artist, and almost always represents a collaboration with chance. Even in the studio, the photographer must negotiate with the subject, which is necessarily recalcitrant, however unconsciously. Out in the world, the photographer is at the mercy of 100 factors: sun, clouds, wind, traffic, vegetation, dogs, cats, urchins, idlers, pedestrians, wires, poles, every sort of human caprice, and above all, the passage of time. Hence the imputation of clairvoyance in photographers, Henri Cartier-Bresson most notably, who succeed in engaging such volatile elements to their advantage. Besides a sharp eye, decent equipment, and a solid grasp of technique, the photographer needs a good bit of luck. It's true that skill can enhance luck, that luck can, to a certain extent, be willed into being, but no one can manipulate luck without also being willing to yield, to become a mere vessel. while a willingness to relinquish full control is required by the other arts as well, as surrender to the subconscious mind. In photography, it is all the more insistent because of the part played by wholly external agencies, especially the mechanism itself. A large portion of the photographer's ego must be ceded to the box, which is exactly what Alfred Stieglitz and his followers were so furiously resisting at the beginning of the 20th century. Between the mediation of the camera and the interference of the 10,000 variables of the world at any given moment, the photographer's conscious participation in the process is severely curtailed. Indeed, consciousness can be an impediment. It is necessary for the photographer to practice a kind of suspension of intent. What is required is something not unlike the process described in Eugen Herrigel's Zen and the Art of Archery, 1953, summed up by D.T. Suzuki in his introduction, quote, "The hitter and the hit are no longer two opposing objects, but are one reality. The archer ceases to be conscious of himself as the one who is engaged in hitting the bullseye which confronts him. This state of unconsciousness is realized only when, completely empty and rid of himself, he becomes one with the perfecting of his technical skill, though there is in it something of a quite different order which cannot be attained by any progressive study of the art." To evoke archery may be somewhat misleading, though. Unlike a bow and arrow, a camera by its nature ensures that some kind of target will always be hit, if not necessarily at the intended target nor in the intended way. Provided that there's film or digital memory in the camera and that the lens cap is off, triggering the shutter is guaranteed to produce an image. But regardless of intent, the success rate is wildly variable. How many exposures do even the greatest photographers make? For every one they judge good enough to print. By contrast, even a thoroughly mediocre practitioner, even a toddler who's never before picked up a camera, can produce an excellent shot. It is possible to say that the process itself is responsible for many photographs, perhaps independently of human agency. For that matter, the artist in some cases may be some amalgam of history, circumstance, equipment, and association. Vernacular photography is always subject to ambiguity. Its specific mission establishes a set of constraints that can liberate an artist from the burden of excess choice, just as they can make it possible for a non-artist to produce a fortuitous work of art through a combination of luck and formula. These constraints, strategic or mercantile or procedural in design, but usually intended to reduce distraction and get to the point, function like some hybrid between the rigors of tradition and the chance operations of modernism. Tradition in art has benefits that are identical to its drawbacks. It allows thought to be suspended in favor of feeling, architecture in favor of embellishment, doubt in favor of faith. While the result can be feeble, servile, repetitive work, tradition can also free the imagination by giving it something to push against. The alchemical transformation of passing trivia and historically moot tragedy into art is a process usually assigned to the artist. In the case of anonymous vernacular photographs, however, it is accomplished by the viewer, who adds a decisive distance that confers upon the photographs a condition opposite to their origins, a certain universality. The viewer looks at obscure individuals and sees archetypes, looks at chaos and sees design, looks at time fleeing and sees time standing still. Photography is in several ways, a collaborative art, by virtue of the relative powerlessness of its practitioners, who can only frame, which is a relative and conditional operation. Because the photographer cannot assert complete control over the contents of the frame, chance determines the measure of the contents, a measure of its contents, and this keeps its meaning in flux. The meaning of a photograph is changed by us and will be further changed by our successors. Like homicide detectives, we learn to recognize patterns, often by intuition and without necessarily even being able to name the connecting thread of a given pattern. The more pictures we see, the more patterns we store in our back brains. And today a child has seen many more photographs than even an alert and curious adult would have a century ago. Thus, we are able to recognize the beauty and meaning in pictures in the past that would have been obscured to their contemporaries by sociological circumstance. That is why our photographic pantheon can now include such disparate figures as Anna Atkins, Solomon Butcher, E.J. Belloc, Eugene de Salignac, Frederick Glacier, Mike Disfarmer, photographers who in their day remain unknown or unrespected, considered at best as competent artisans, at worst as dog and pony exhibitors. And this process will continue as we allow ourselves to be instructed by the great range of photography. Photography has been around for the better part of 200 years, and yet we're just beginning to plumb its depths. Decades ago, someone wrote a book about the Hollywood movies of the 1930s that he called The Genius of the System. That's a phrase that often occurs to me when I think about photography, which is not merely a technology used by individual humans to make pictures, but a collective enterprise with its own logic and an unstable collaboration between humans and machines, and a way of looking that has less and less in common with the paradigms we've derived from drawing and painting. Photography is a broad continuum of which self-consciously artistic expression occupies only a very small portion, but in which art can potentially occur at any point, at any time. Photography involves seeing, selecting, and preserving, and that sequence holds whether the action entails choosing a site from out of the world and fixing it to film or digital memory with the use of an apparatus, or choosing a picture that has already been made and fixing it to a new context by discovering its latent meaning. But the latter operation is both deepened and bedeviled by the unresolvable mystery of the original maker's intention. What was this person thinking in Bridgeport, Nebraska on a summer afternoon sometime around 1909? Thank you. I apologize for the sequencing of the pictures. I kind of lost my way a few times. So there were some clever matchups there. It didn't happen. Anyway, well, I'll be happy to take questions now. If you'll allow me to put my glasses so I can see you. No question. Yes, Robert.
Luke, one thing I was thinking is, how do you put it? The question is that kind of artistry that we might put on the image, like the crime pictures, like the Bertillon photos. It seems that the people making the photos were only recording evidence, and that was it for them.
Right.
So we've taken them to another level.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether it's up or down, but is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So we've taken something and made it into a whole nother thing. Is that what you're saying?
That's the point, yeah. Yeah, I mean, not just crime photographs, but, you know, all kinds of photographs that were taken. Well, you know, it probably applies to pictures that are taken today that will only be visible in some new way in 50 years, whatever. There's probably, you know, somewhere on Flickr there are pictures that, you know, will look amazing as soon as context shifts, you know. But virtually just about every single picture I've showed you in the slideshow was intended for some purpose, and sometimes we can figure out what that purpose was, and sometimes we can't. But in all cases, we are viewing the pictures differently than their makers or initial audiences did. Every single case. Yes, back there. You might need to walk up to the microphone. Oh, somebody's going to give you. the microphone.
In the group of images that preceded the crime scene photographs where there were victims, you kept speaking about absence in those images.
I'm sorry?
You were speaking about the absence that was really present in those
Yeah.
images, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because I sort of was recognizing the presence of the objects and the things that were present in the photograph, and the only thing that pointed at that absence was the captioning or the framing that these were crime photographs. And so also I was wondering where, I mean, I believe you mentioned it, but where those crime photographs were received from again, or how you know they were crime photographs? The group, obviously, that I think it was after.
Not the municipal archives, but these other pictures.
Correct,
right.
after the municipal archives. Exactly.
Yeah, well, I mean, by absence, I mean that, you know, they're all about the aftermath of a crime. And yes, you're right. I mean, yes, there's inflexible presence of a floor, a piece of furniture, a wall, whatever. This is true. But those things would not be of interest without the narrative background, without the thing that is missing, without the action that caused them to have been altered in some way so that they become a photographable subject. You know, that ceiling, nobody would ever have taken a picture of it under any sort of circumstance. That's what I mean by absence. They're sort of charged, they're pregnant with that stuff. And the fact is, it's my untested theory that you kind of know that when you look. I mean, if you know, I don't know, maybe try a survey sometime, mailing, you know, a copy of these pictures to random citizens saying, you know, what do you think this picture was made for? But it's, in any event, there's, they are charged. That's my feeling about them, is that they, because of their very banality, the banality and the strangeness of them, and the angle, the fact that you're looking up at a ceiling or down at a floor or at some piece of furniture shoved together, that you somehow, whether you're consciously aware of it, know that they, you know, that they are pictures of something invisible, fundamentally. Well, what was the other question you had?
Well, it wasn't that. It was more I was thinking about what it was in the photographs that allowed you to sort of arrive at that conclusion, or
Oh.
if it's just a matter of them being framed as crime photographs, that then there's this absence that's felt because you're aware that's obviously some event or some action had happened.
Right, yeah. I mean, because there's, you know, even if, like, you can tell, like, okay, the ceiling panels are butted in or something like that, broken window, whatever, you can tell, or, you know, chalk mark on the floor around a handkerchief, you know, these are signs. But sometimes it's just a matter of a really banal room being photographed with such apparent intensity, like, you know, a couple of armchairs shoved together. It's not, you know, what was this made for? You know, the mind reels. I mean, it's not a real estate photograph. It's not made to, you know, show the grandchildren. It's, you know, and you go through every possible purpose that this picture could have been made for. And finally, a crime scene photograph is the only kind of photograph that will call to the front of the room such impenetrable banality. Really, that's the beauty of crime pictures for me. It's not the violence; it's the banality.
Thanks.
Yes.
Because so many of these images that you're showing us and talking us about have the distance of time, and they had originally some kind of utilitarian purpose, and you find this absence and banality inside of that. Do you think that they have more potential for different interpretations and possible meanings over time than, say, the fine art photograph that people create in contemporary times and try to imbue with some sort of conceptual meaning or framework that then is put out and almost packaged in a way, whereas
Right.
these had some utilitarian function and weren't sent with the same information?
Well, in the very best way, they're unself-conscious. Art photographs are always self-conscious, even when they're good. And, especially if it's like a kind of imitate, if it's like an also-ran photograph, intended as art that's clearly following in the style of, which is a great deal. I mean, the overwhelming majority of art photographs. Whereas these, made for a particular purpose, they, they're homing in on something and being unconscious of all this other stuff, But, at the same time, I mean, this is my star exhibit here, because this picture absolutely defies any explanation, I think. I mean, it's not sufficiently informative to really, I mean, the only thing I can think of is, yeah, conceivably it was one of the relics of some tornado that swept through Bridgeport, Nebraska. And there used to be something there that people remembered. And the absence of that thing in connection with the sign makes it would have made it a kind of memento mori for the people of Bridgeport, Nebraska right then. But from our point of view, I mean, there's nothing obvious. It's not, it's plenty of real photo postcards. They're beauty shots, or, they show the faces of grandpa and grandma, or, or it's the new piglets born to the sow, whatever. They have some kind of identifiable focus, or they're completely like, they were, they're the equivalent of, taking a picture with your ass, but something like this seems to have been composed. It's you can break it down. It's got a formal structure. Why?
Definitely. So I guess what I'm also wondering is, so there's a certain amount of naivete and freshness, almost like childlike freshness, by not having the pressures of the outside world or understanding one's contemporaries or movements in history, then create more potential for possibility?
Well, that's the thing. That's an open question, because you realize that, photography got so little respect until pretty recently. Really, I mean, for example, I mean, I didn't study history of photography because when I went to college in the 1970s, there was no such thing. The the Metropolitan Museum of Art did not detach its Department of Photographs from its Department of Prints and Drawings until the mid-1980s. In general, people had a vague idea of what artistic photography was supposed to look like. They might, remember like a few key pictures from the past. But if you ask the average citizen, what's an art photograph? And they usually think of, some still life with shadows or some dramatic angle thing. But people did not have, your generation, or like, just about the first one or maybe the second, to have this grasp of photography, to have all this photographic history in your brains. So it's very, very difficult for you to be unself-conscious. But before that, you have, pardon me?
We're literally drowning in images.
Yeah, yeah. But before that, you've gone from like night to day, or vice versa. Before that, you had really like the 150 years where people only had a very limited idea of what photography was. And even professional photographers were not, drowning in references, did not feel self-conscious every time they pulled the trigger. I mean, it was, okay, they'd seen the Civil War photographs, but not much else. They'd seen small-town portrait photography, but not much more than that. They had no idea what was going on in their time or what had gone on 50 years earlier. So you had 150 years where people could be like, Adam naming the animals, kind of, and it's, so, I mean, people have, this is a question I get asked a lot. I mean, I said before that maybe Flickr will reveal pictures in 50 years that look very different. I don't know if that's the case or not. I'm not a soothsayer. I mean, one thing about Flickr that was, I tentatively advanced one hypothesis, which I think has fallen apart for me since, but that is, with Flickr, or Facebook or anything else, that the basic unit is no longer the photograph; it's the set. Maybe. But other than that, I mean, I really, do we all know too much now? So are we talking about a historically delimited phenomenon, even though it's kind of a vast stretch of history, really? I mean, from 1830s to about 1980s, in which people could take photographs without being haunted by the ghosts of all earlier photography. That's an open question.
Thank you.
Yes.
I was going to say it's kind of an interesting point that there's such a quality of like unconscious presence in these photos, where like today it's almost, I mean, and that was acquired through, and that was like acquired through, like having to take a photo,
Yeah.
and now and today it's a lot of times like I'm guilty of this is sometimes I'm taking photos. There's no point.
Yeah.
And I think we're all like kind of participating in it, so I think things are getting watered down in a way. I don't know.
Well, sure, and plus, not to mention that, for most of this history, I mean, taking a photograph was a really, not only was the focus of the photographer honed and pointed by the task at hand, but also taking a photograph was a big production. Today we go click, and I'm sure your cat has taken photographs at this point, right? If you've left your phone sitting on the desk, it wasn't like that. I mean, just the process of sliding the plates in, all this stuff. You had to winnow down. You had to be really sure that this picture that you were taking, it was a bet you were making. You were putting a lot of money on the table. I mean, figuratively speaking, you were making a large bet every time you took a picture, so you did not take a picture idly. Yes. Microphone on third row here, second row.
Hi. Do you think it's possible to return to a state of visual naivete? And if so, could that be valuable? And if so, how could we do that?
No, that's an excellent question. Wow, if I knew that one, I'm sure I could make a lot of money holding workshops across the country. I don't know. I mean, is it possible to do with photography what the surrealists did with prose, or with visual art? I mean, the surrealists had all kinds of tricks for returning to naivete. Decalcomania, rubbing, falling asleep and uttering words, opening books and stabbing your finger on the next line of your poem, can you do that with photography? And I almost think that that's already been, all of these things have already been done in a way with photography. I don't know. Again, if I knew, I'd be sitting pretty. So maybe it's all up to all of you to discover that magic secret. Yes.
I think you didn't really talk about it so much tonight, but I know in your essay on Walker Evans, you talk about the influence of what you see as the influence of the picture postcards on sort of later, more self-conscious photographers throughout the 20th century.
Right.
And I was wondering, because I was really struck looking at these tonight by the resemblance of a lot of, particularly the later crime scene photographs to like, even like really contemporary art photography of like interiors and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, I assume that those pictures are not something that really anyone was looking at, unlike the picture postcards. And also, I mean, I don't know, I guess the first question is, would anyone have been seeing those? And furthermore, sort of, how do you see
Would anyone what?
Would anyone have really been seeing any of the crime scene photographs outside of that? And what's the sort of effect that you see of the difference in these two things on the place of those in the cultural visual
Of the
narrative? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. You know, of course, I mean, okay, the thing about Walker Evans and the picture postcard is, you know, it was a revolution because they learned how to do things simply, in a word. You know, art photography was all about making things complicated for a while because of the photo secession, all that, and what Evans and his contemporaries retrieved from vernacular photography was the you know the beauty and the pleasure of the broadside of the barn. Now these crime scene photographs, well, I mean, no, nobody would have seen these. Cops, maybe lawyers, you know, but not even journalists, not even, you know, nobody else, no general public. They were not exhibited, they were not published. They just existed for a specific purpose, and then they were filed away. And, you know, the crime scene photographs in many cases, as in not the set in the municipal archives, but the other set, I mean, they are fairly representative of one phenomenon, which is that of cops taking photographs home. So, you know, we have these great collections of crime scene photographs from around the world, largely based on cops, you know, kind of stealing these things that might otherwise have been destroyed. And I don't know, I'm fascinated by these. I'm still kind of processing them. You know, I've had these pictures, the second set, for about 2 years now, and I've written so far three versions of the essay connected to them, and every time I kind of see them a little bit differently. I'm really interested in them because, you know, because they're reminiscent of that first set, but then the first set, you know, they've got kind of your built-in box office appeal. They're dead people. You know, there's a lot of like, there's a lot of stuff. You know, there's an implied narrative which you can kind of piece together, but there's also like, you know, the contents of a slum apartment in New York City in 1912 or, you know, 1916. The others, though, these are blander. You know, people didn't like pin up as much stuff on their walls in the 1930s. Mostly was wallpaper and kind of dull, like, department store furniture. There's no, you know, the narrative is completely by implication. There's nothing that you can, you know, in any of these pictures, by the way. I showed you a few, but, you know, in these 100 photographs, there's not a single one. There's one that might show a bullet, but I'm not even sure. It might be something else. There are things that are circled in chalk or whatever, but you can't really figure that out. So it's, you know, I have a feeling I have yet to get to the bottom of these pictures, really. I mean, it's an intuition on my part. I feel like they have something more to say that I haven't found yet. But it's something to do possibly with interiors, with how lives are recorded, with how objects record, you know, the metonymy of objects standing in for people's lives, with, you know, the way that, like, every kind of corner of a room is inhabited but never examined from the outside, with different kinds of intimacy. There is an intimacy about these pictures. That's what strikes me the most. You know, the ones of the furniture, these rooms, the floors, you know, the scuffing of the linoleum. There's something kind of deeply, like, you know, it's not like looking at the dead person and having this feeling that I had when I looked at those pictures, the corpses, the first time was like, I'm not supposed to be looking at these. It's like, you know, watching somebody on the toilet, but more so. I mean, it's just, you know, this is not a sight for my eyes or anybody else's. And with these pictures, it's not quite that prohibited thing, but it feels like an intrusion. It's like you've walked into the neighbor's apartment and you're looking around and you're not really supposed to be there. And it's not like you want to steal something, but in a way you are. You're like, you know, it's like, you know that old thing about photography boxing the soul. Well, it's kind of like that, but through the intermediary of these rooms and these objects. So, yeah, it's something about intimacy and portraiture that's going on for me there. Sir.
Hi, yeah, I was wondering if you could speak to perhaps the power of your curating these images and how they might be affecting how they're viewed. After all, when you take a bunch of images out of history, out of a collection, and then you resort them, you are creating a narrative, and you are, just from hearing you speak, there's a magic to the way you speak, and there's an interest in the way you're thinking. So I'm wondering a little bit where you end and the actual content of this work that we've been sort of thinking about begins. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I do. Yeah. Right. Well, I'm probably the last person to be able to answer that one adequately. It's like it'll be much more apparent to somebody else, because for me it feels like, what I'm saying. I can't. It's very hard for me to view that while simultaneously cutting myself out of the process. Yeah, I'm aware that what I do, it does involve assigning a new meaning. By putting them together, by selecting pictures, by sequencing them, by adding text, around them and so on. Yes, inevitably this will happen. It's making, it's making yet another object. It's adding another leg to the table, well, I mean, that's going to be the case no matter who makes their own selections. It's very interesting. I mean, with the police evidence photographs, by the way, I mean, I can say the original set, it sort of has, I do have a kind of correlative in that way, because Joel Peter Whitkin did it. There's a book of his called, anybody remember? There's a book by Joel Peter Whitkin, which is selections from these pictures. It came out like a couple of years after my book did, as well as images from the Kinsey collection in Indiana, and these, I forget, but it's 4 groups of vernacular. Harm's Way, thank you very much. And well, first of all, he had them printed. He was able to get access to the original plates. My book doesn't look that great because, well, not only does it precede scanning because it's 20 years ago, but it's also made from internegatives, which is the most I could get from the municipal archives. He managed to get access to the plates, and his pictures, oddly enough, I mean, I don't know, they look fuzzy to me. It looks like he worked to get rid of that sharpness, which is one of the things I most value about them. And then he sees them in a different way. It's been a long time since I've read the text or looked at that book, but I know that, yeah, you could compare like what I did with these pictures and what he did with the pictures, and we picked some pictures in common, inevitably, but it's going to be like a whole different thing. And by the way, the whole police collection, as it stands right now, all of it is online, right, as of about a year ago. So you can, all of you can make your own selection, put your own frame around it, and see how it compares with mine. The embarrassing thing is that when they went online, and I went and looked, I looked through all, 1,400 images or something they have up there, and I thought, my book is ridiculous. I mean, I picked the wrong pictures. Why did I miss that one? That one's incredible, and I picked this one instead, which is like, another angle, which is so much duller than that one. So I want to go back and redo the whole thing, except I have to, I need another life in which to do half my projects. So anyway, that may have to wait a while.
Hi, I'm all the way up in the back. All the way up to the
Hi. Yeah,
Hi.
you're in the shadow there.
I had another question about your selection, which was you mentioned briefly that you received a box stuffed with photographs from basically a garage in Pennsylvania somewhere when you sent them a list of what you were looking for to find images for your book. And I was wondering, what was that loss of translation between what you asked them for and what they sent you that just wasn't suitable? Was it because it lacked the violence or the?
Wait a
the-
minute, say that, I missed something there. Wasn't suitable?
You said that you received a box filled with lovely photographs that you just couldn't use.
Oh, no, no, no. I think you misheard. No, I used a lot of those pictures. They were great. The one difference, though, is that they were, they showed a lot of public subjects. They showed saloons, they showed flop houses, they showed streets, all of it great. But what I wanted to know was how people lived. I wanted to know what their apartments looked like. And there was none of that. There was no interior because these were taken as news photographs, and they were fantastic, some of them, with completely anonymous photographers. We don't have a single name for Brown Brothers, as far as I know, except for the two founding Brown Brothers. But they're fantastic photographs. But they did, because perforce, for why they were taken, there are no pictures of people's intimate lives.
Hello. Hi. Oh, I have the mic.
Oh, hi.
I have a question. I guess I'm not really aware. Is there kind of like a genre of crime scene photography now that is separate from the internet? Because when you were talking about those photos up there of like the absence,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's totally about the context of when they were made that we can believe that those are crime scene because, as you said, like image overload, you see so many of those now. Like if you probably type in sinking ceiling in Google, you could find so many that aren't crime scene or anything. So I'm just kind of curious if like what crime scene photos look like at this point, and if it's like the tabloids that you go to.
Well, there was a great thing in the Times, golly, year and a half, 2 years ago maybe, that showed this like extreme wide angle, like a 360 degree sweep of a room. It was really awesome. And I know that a lot of places, crime scene photography by the cops has become all moving images. It's become all, video, as it were. With no stills, really. I mean, because it's about coverage and because the medium has changed. And so these kind of static crime scene pictures, like the ones I've shown you, they haven't really been a feature since, since film went out of fashion. I mean, it's a different bill of goods now altogether. They're still trying to record the same stuff, but the way in which they can record it is very different. And that too, I mean, I'm sure that is one thing that will probably gain in richness and meaning over time. So the crime scene stuff that's being done now. I know that, I mean, the more recent things I've seen, a pre-digital era, but more recent than these, I've seen in two separate sets of medical examiner Polaroids that were just beyond belief. I mean, really scary things that were, but again, something about the framing, like with postcards, there's something about the Polaroid. And the dimensions of the Polaroid, the kind of softness, slight softness the Polaroid has, the way the Polaroid does color, that it becomes its own genre. And to combine the Polaroid, which is fascinating in and of itself, I think, with medical examiner pictures of corpses, bullet entry wounds, all this kind of stuff, that's a whole other world. So yeah, there's lots of unexplored terrain there. Yes.
I have a question about just photography versus other art forms. So these are framed and these are produced in a certain manner, and the photos that you showed us were crime scene photographs. But then there are quote unquote art photographs where the content is decidedly not a crime scene. It doesn't have that import. So the medium of photography, it doesn't seem to have a distinction between a crime photograph and an art photograph, whereas a painting of a crime scene I mean, I'm trying to say, does photography still have a lot to live up to other art forms like painting, as far as being able to rise to the occasion?
Well, I mean, I think my point was that, photography, I mean, one of the great things about vernacular photography is that, as a rule, vernacular photography of various sorts vernacular photography was pioneering in the sense that it became pure photography, as opposed to art photography, which for decades and decades and decades was still trying to rival or imitate poetry, that's interesting too, but painting, drawing, engraving. Art photographers had in mind the art history. Vernacular photographers had no such thing in mind. They were just recording whatever they were recording. And so the effects they got were accidental, or they were incidental, or they were made up on the spot, or they may have had their own particular philosophy inarticulate to the viewer, but maybe they knew it. But in any case, they were not beholden to this other visual traditions. I mean, things are very different now because photography has become its own tradition, which, I mean, in a way, you could say there was already, by the time this picture was made in circa 1907 to 8 or 9, there had been a great deal of great photography already made, but there were very few humans, if any, who had a grasp of more than a few inches of it anywhere in the world. So now, I mean, photographers are no longer thinking of painting or sculpture or engraving, but they are thinking, and it's almost impossible not to be thinking of photography when you're taking a picture. If you're alive in the world and are exposed to images, you know what the repository of images is. Hi, front row.
I was interested in the point you made about the different cities' crime photos having a distinct style, and sort of, I mean, is that because of the content in the photos and each city's sort of look, or you're saying that there was sort of an internal kind of style of the department? So
Well, that's a mystery. I don't really know. Well, I'll show you. This picture is from a bunch of pictures from the LAPD, and this, I mean, I don't know. I don't have any information about these pictures. A friend of mine found them online somewhere and couldn't remember what the site was, and I was never able to retrieve them. It looks like a movie still, but they all have these markings on them, and some of them don't look like movie stills, and I'm just baffled. It's also an action shot, which is, a whole other thing. The pictures in Paris, there you can kind of see, because the pictures in Paris, the famous ones, by Bertillon and his associates, they've been published various places. There's also this remarkable book called the Paris Crime Album by Eugenia Parigianis, which reproduces a whole lot of them, some really gruesome pictures. You can see the relation between those pictures and the NYPD World War I era pictures, because the NYPD World War I era pictures are sort of following, in a general loose, baggy way, the instructions given by Bertillon, which is, for example, when covering photographically a prone body, you take a picture from overhead, two opposing 45-degree angles, from 3 yards away, 10 yards. I mean, they're all very, very precise indications. And in the Paris pictures, they're carried out to the letter. The New York pictures, they're very loose, and in the meantime, all sorts of people have walked through the room, and the body has been kicked over 5 feet, and but you can still see like where there's a kind of relationship. There's also different lenses at work, so that the lenses in the Paris pictures do a different kind of distortion from the ones in the New York pictures. And then you look at the pictures from Australia, the Sydney pictures, which there's a remarkable book called City of Shadows by Peter Doyle. And like they didn't have the Paris model or the New York model. They were recording in some other way. It just, I don't know. I haven't made that concerted or rigorous a study of them to begin to answer any of these things. What is it about one city that determines the style overall? Is it a matter of some protocol of lighting, some use of some particular lens they had, or some kind of institutional procedure that gave rise to something that looks like a style. It would be a great PhD dissertation for somebody.
I have one follow-up. Do you think, did they ever use photos for reconstructing a scene of a crime, or
Did they ever use photos for what?
to sort of reenact maybe a crime, or sort of?
Yeah, that's possible. That's what this looks like to me. It looks like a reenactment. And we know that, reenactments did happen for various reasons. You see that, in fact, a great book, which, by the way, I should say that when I put out my book Evidence in 1992, I was weirdly ignorant of the other book called Evidence by Mike Myers and what's that? Mike Mandel and Larry Sultan. Yeah. Whenever I stand on the stage, my memory goes for shit. But anyway, there, you see reenactments, or what might be reenactments of something. Those are really, really interesting. Interesting collection of vernacular pictures taken from a variety of institutional contexts. They were given, because this was a time when nobody was interested in this stuff. They were doing their research in the early to mid 70s, and they had this astounding list of government agencies, private companies, you name it, that just opened their photographic archives to them, and they just picked the weirdest pictures they could find. And with their book, it's like, in at least 9 cases out of 10, you have no idea what's going on. And so it's a really surrealist book. They're not going for any particular, they're not trying to characterize these pictures. They're just looking for the unexplored surrealistic continent of photography. So anyway, there are things that look like reenactments in there. I wouldn't be entirely surprised if this wasn't some kind of reenactment, and maybe made for police or legal use. But beyond that, your guess is as good as mine. Yes.
I wanted to ask if you had your postcard book that you said you were thinking of.
Oh, it came out, yeah. It was published in 2009. It's called Folk Photography. And I don't have a copy with me, but I guess it can be bought at your better bookstores, published by Yeti, the fabulous Yeti Books of Portland, Oregon.
Luke, I think we need to make room for Ken
Oh
Burns.
yeah, we got big important documentary filmmakers coming here, so thank you very much.